is the final in a series of energy equity webinars organized by Policy Integrity with the generous support of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Institute for Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan academic think tank dedicated to improving the quality of governmental decision-making. We use economics and law to support smart policies for the environment, public health, and consumers. Our goal in these conversations is to bridge the gap between research and real-life policymaking. Each of these webinars have academic researchers supported by the Sloan Foundation, as well as policy experts who work on these topics on a daily basis. We hope that these conversations inform policymakers with the latest insights from cutting-edge research and result in better policies. At the same time, we hope these conversations can inform researchers with open policy questions and help them understand how they can focus their research for a bigger policy impact. Today, we're going to be talking about place-based research on energy justice and clean energy development, including how such research can inform state and national policymaking. Our panelists will reflect on frameworks and tools used in place-based research, as well as the unique and important role of minority-serving institutions in advancing this kind of research. We will also talk about research design strategies for ensuring that processes and results serve the communities researchers are engaging in. Today's conversation is going to be moderated by Al Huang. Al is the Environmental Justice Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity and a lawyer. His work uses a model that focuses on legal and technical assistance when invited to grassroots groups in low-income communities and communities of color facing disproportionate burdens such as toxic pollution. Al, the mic is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, in whatever time zone you're in. Really excited to have you here today. I've been really looking forward to this webinar on place-based energy transition research. And without further ado, we've heard the explanation already of what the today's webinar is about. I'm going to get to introducing our great panelists, and I'm going through their bios for a bit. So our first group of speakers presenting are Nadia Ahmad and Dr. Elise Harrington. Nadia is an associate professor at Barry University School of Law, and Professor Ahmad's research explores the intersections of energy siting, the environment, and sustainable development, and draws on international investment law and corporate responsibility. Her Sloan Foundation research aims to develop a place-based just energy transition framework by undertaking 4 community-engaged case studies in Florida, Kansas, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania. Dr. Elise Harrington is an assistant professor in the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy area at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. She studies infrastructure, energy, and environmental policymaking with a focus on how interpersonal relationships and social organization influence the design and implementation of policies, programs, and services in response to climate change mitigation and adaptation activities. Dr. Harrington received her PhD in environmental policy and planning from Massachusetts Institute for Technology in 2020. Our second speaker will be Dr. Connor Harrison. He joined the Department of Geography and the School of Earth, Ocean and Environment at the University of South Carolina in 2014 after receiving his PhD in geography from the University of North Carolina. His research examines the relationship between energy and society and is focused on questions at the intersection of race, the historical development of electricity supply systems and markets in the American South, as well as the ongoing energy transition in the Caribbean and the role of finance in reshaping the U.S. electricity system. His Sloan Foundation research involves examining what a just transition means for local communities, labor movements, and energy vulnerable populations in South Carolina and Tennessee. Our third presenter is Dr. Brian Patterson, who is an assistant professor and chair of the Public Leadership Studies concentration Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at Johnson C. Smith University. Dr. Patterson has taught and developed courses in both the graduate and undergraduate levels with a primary focus on leadership studies and development. His current research interests include individual and organizational leadership, change management, and social entrepreneurship development in nonprofit and community organizations. He's a recipient of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation grant to examine the systemic barriers facing researchers in minority-serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities across the Southeast in undertaking clean energy research. And our final presenter is Dr. Elise Taylor Anyakiri, who serves as the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy. She focuses on state, local, and tribal engagement, as well as advising on clean energy, equity, resilience, and energy cybersecurity. Prior to returning to DOE, Elise worked with the National Governors Association, advising governors' offices on electricity policy, energy cybersecurity, and energy resilience. Elise has a doctorate and a master's degree in electrical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. She also has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Florida A&M University. So without further ado, we'll start with our first presentation from Professor Ahmad and Dr. Harrington. So pass it off to you two.
Good morning / afternoon. Thank you, Al, and also to NYU's Institute for Policy Integrity for hosting this webinar. I'll be co-presenting our project with Professor Elise Harrington from the University of Minnesota. Our research project hones in on the idea of just energy transitions in place. We suggest the deployment of community-engaged research and public-private partnerships. My talk will proceed in 3 parts. First, I'm going to give a brief overview and look at how we're conceptualizing the formulation of just energy transitions. And second, I'm going to turn to the systems that we're going to be using as vectors to hypothesize an accelerated transition. Third, I'm going to speak about capacity building for deployment. Our multifaceted project aims at facilitating a more comprehensive understanding of energy transition policies. We've adopted a mixed methods approach designed to anchor the concept of just energy transitions within the context of unique local characteristics, while simultaneously offering comparative insights across varying policies and jurisdictions. This approach is intended to equip policymakers and with substantive evidence to help guide their decisions. Our strategy also includes an in-depth analysis of 4 distinct case studies. This study involves conducting over 100 qualitative interviews and organizing 8 to 16 different focus groups. And we're also going to add depth to our analysis by looking at each of these case studies that we're going to supplement with state and local data that is going to allow us to effectively characterize shifts in local and economic landscapes. In complementing our case study research, we're going to conduct a national comparative policy analysis. This will involve the evaluation of local energy transition policies across diverse parameters, such as technology, behaviors, institutions, and policy tools. So now I want to turn to a more pressing question that we face today, which is, how are we going to achieve 100% transition to renewable energy, which is completely possible? And so from our perspective, the answer lies in establishing a well-coordinated information and policy network regime. Even for small and medium-sized cities and rural areas, despite whatever budget constraints and technical mandates they may face, it's possible to develop effective financing mechanisms for renewable energy projects. And our project really aims to make it possible by sharing the necessary data and expertise. This will allow us to evaluate the potential for renewable energy in both metropolitan areas and through the case studies that we look at in regions that may be lacking these specific resources. In our 4 case study locations, Florida, Louisiana, Kansas, and Pennsylvania, were selected to underscore the various conditions and local conditions that need to be considered when developing just energy transition policies. These variations include the rural-urban divide, as well as the scale of clean energy solutions and potential economic and cultural losses and gains. And in this photo that you see before you is the evacuation of a nursing home following the loss of power during Hurricane Ian in Florida. And so moving on to the second part of my talk, I wanted to dive into the key vectors or the dimensions that we use for our analytical framework. We believe that just transition policies have to be more inclusive of multiple factors, such as economics and labor, local patterns of risk and resilience, justice in its multiple forms, and historical understandings of loss and damage that continue to shape today's energy justice landscape. While jobs and workforce are a really crucial part of this work, we intend to broaden this analysis to encapsulate socioeconomic dimensions as well. And so from the point of view of economics and labor, we examine the fluctuating job market for both losses and gains across urban and rural regions in the US. This has also brought about shifts related to resource extraction, refining, and electricity generation sectors. And by understanding these specific shifts, we're going to be able to have more insights into the economic implications of transitioning to more sustainable energy sources. And so secondly, we look at the local patterns of risk and resilience. This analysis delves specifically into how we see the impacts of climate change, including extreme weather, alterations in temperature and humidity, and flooding. These changes can also shift the risk and vulnerabilities in energy and infrastructure needs. We also pay particular attention to frontline communities, as these groups often bear the brunt of such changes. And then turning to the concept of justice, thirdly, we acknowledge its various forms in our analysis. We look at the historical inequities in access to energy-related jobs, environmental and health repercussions from the energy sector, unequal distribution of clean energy generation, and transmission systems among communities of color, low-income populations, and indigenous or tribal groups. Additionally, we also take into account inequitable access to benefits for clean energy. In each of its component parts, this analysis really looks at addressing the concept of energy justice. And so last but not least, we look at the idea of loss and damage, which really helps us to identify the remedies and reparations for historically disproportionate damages that have resulted from energy development, as well as from the current inequities that are brought about by changes to the energy system. So while we're formulating the framework for loss and damage, we also consider the background factors that have influenced it and also are going to amplify the inequitable damages during the energy transition, because not everybody is going to be moving forward at the same rate. And many communities may in fact be left behind if they are not brought to the front line. And so these factors are going to include redlining, mortgage inequities, foreclosures, and the housing crisis, and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, historical practices of slavery, and tribal land dispossession. We also have shared our preliminary literature review of the law and policy portion of our project in the Georgia State Law Review article on synthesizing just energy transitions that was just published on Monday. And so finally, I wanted to emphasize the critical aspect of renewable energy development and about the need for meaningful public participation. Undoubtedly, sustainable development hinges on incorporating the voices of people whom development will directly impact. And some even consider this integration to being among the most significant advances in resource management since the inception of the environmental movement itself. Stewardship-driven environmental initiatives are a testament to this. They not only enhance community environmental and civic capacities, but they also provide social capacity with measurable beneficial impacts. Meaningful public participation in these initiatives can lead to better project outcomes, increased acceptance, and reduced conflicts, while also encouraging local ownership and pride. So thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to Elise, who will share more about our project details.
Thank you, Nadia, for detailing our overall study, the proposed analytical framework that we're using, and the importance of addressing these broader impacts. I will close us out with further details on our research design and kind of the progress to date. And critically, our project really centers on understanding how this common set of dimensions varies based on the place-based nature of energy transitions and how to do this in a comparative research approach. Our cross-case analysis is grounded by that common framework described by Nadia, as well as by a common set of methods that we are kind of designing and deploying across the 4 case study states and within each state. Our approach and proposed framework explores the ways that just energy transitions can reflect these local needs, localized past experiences, and the ongoing efforts to address racial and other socioeconomic inequities. We are using this common analytical framework to then kind of inductively highlight or surface what it means to have kind of these place-based differences and similarities. We seek to better understand and then theorize about what contributes to unique conceptions of just energy transitions and relatedly unique responses to renewable energy access across our 4 case states and then within each state. To provide the flexibility to understand how place is informing both statewide and more localized energy transition dynamics, we are designing processes for stakeholders and project partners to help us identify kind of priority areas within each case while ensuring a common research process and design. This effort to kind of engage stakeholders and project partners throughout our research activities is another way that we're seeking to kind of broaden the reach of our work. So to do this, we are starting with a series of scoping workshops beginning underway this summer with our team members at Penn State University focused on our Pennsylvania case. And we will follow these by interviews and focus groups that are responsive to what we're learning through these initial scoping workshops. Our team brings these prior relationships and an interest in building these new partnerships with practitioners to this work to underpin kind of different styles of engaged research activities across our 4 cases. As we really start to dig into our workshop and interview designs, already institutional, technological, social, and political dimensions are starting to emerge as influential in how renewable energy decision-making processes vary across our cases, such as dimensions like local government authority or variation in the type and scale of renewable energy, or how new renewable energy development may or may not be connected to legacy energy infrastructure and legacy energy industries. We began this project with the proposition that just energy transitions may look quite different in different places based on what is understood to be locally salient and locally impactful. And we expect these differences to continue to emerge both in the state level policy dynamics as well as the more localized kind of areas of both resistance and support for renewable energy development. Within each state, so within each of our cases, we will look at local dynamics in at least 2 selected geographies to assess the ways that changes in energy development and infrastructure may not be experienced uniformly within a state. This may be based on differing local needs, goals, and contexts to inform those much more localized policy priorities and how individuals and groups are engaging in those transition policies and processes. We aim to understand the sources of resistance and the opportunities for change, as well as the variety of these localized impacts that are stemming from the transition to renewable energy. Each state level case study will use focus groups to explore these more localized experiences. And the geographic areas of these focus groups are one of the key components that will be informed by these scoping workshops we are shortly undertaking. We expect that sub-state assessments will help contextualize state decisions while also identifying similarities and differences that may not be readily apparent at a statewide policy level. We are doing this work with an interdisciplinary team, really seeking to build interdisciplinary understanding. And one example of this is that we recently conducted an internal team process of identifying kind of our areas of prior experience, our core competencies, and areas of growth to ensure as a team that we are continually striving to complement one another and provide avenues to learn new skills. This seemingly simple exercise This seemingly simple exercise was done at first to help us identify areas that we would benefit from advisory board expertise, but really helped us uncover the breadth and depth of prior experience and the many opportunities that our team can learn from one another. So with that, we wanted to kind of introduce our team, the core of our project, spanning the fields of law, public policy, urban planning, and geography. And so with that, thank you all for your time and attention, and I will turn it back to our esteemed moderator.
Thank you, Professor Ahmad and Professor Harrington. Really appreciated the presentation. Next up, we have Dr. Connor Harrison, who will be presenting. And I'm going to hand it over to him.
Okay, I think I'm all set. Hopefully everybody can see that. Thank you for having me today. So I'm Connor Harrison. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina. And I really appreciate the group pulling us together today. I've already had some interesting thoughts from the project that we saw before. So the title of the project that the Sloan Foundation funded that I'm a part of is called As Goes the South, Community and Worker Solutions for a Just Transition in South Carolina and Tennessee. See if we can get this to move. Okay, so our primary goal in this project is to think about, in this moment of contestation over energy systems across the US South. And so just as context, in the South, we have a traditionally regulated electricity system. In South Carolina and in Tennessee, we have a couple of really massive investor-owned electric utilities. We also have a federally sort of quasi-federal utility in Tennessee. So we have these really sort of traditional, large, vertically integrated utilities here, but they've been faced with a lot of kind of pressure from all sides over the last few years to reform, to rethink. And this has been both from sort of the sort of state level actors, as well as kind of grassroots activism as well. So given this sort of background in these places, and if we think about the sort of broader energy transition that's happening, what might a just transition mean for communities, for workers, and for energy vulnerable populations in these two states? And so our project is organized primarily around these three research questions. So we want to understand what the priorities of energy vulnerable communities are. So these are people for whom the energy system is already not really working. So as we have a system that's changing, how can we rethink or understand what a better system might be for those folks? We also want to understand what the goals and needs are of regional energy sector workers. And we have an interesting case in South Carolina where it's very much a non-union state. Versus in Tennessee, most of the energy workers are unionized. So we have this really kind of interesting dichotomy between these two groups, but there's also a lot of other energy workers, if they're solar installers, if they're linemen, and there's lots of different iterations of that. There's training programs. So we're trying to understand what the goals and needs are of these groups. And then we want to think about these together in terms of what's actually happening. What are the things that we're hearing through the interviews that we're conducting? And then understanding what are the legal and regulatory frameworks that are going to actually empower these communities to achieve visions of energy justice. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. So our work is grounded, and you'll see we're primarily a mix of geographers and lawyers. And we ground our work on what we refer to as legal geography. And there's a sort of the small subfield that looks at this. And basically, I mean, to put it really briefly, what legal geography is it's just the understanding that laws and policies cannot be understood in isolation from their material, social, locational context. And basically, it's an argument that laws don't just emerge out of thin air, that they come out of actual places and they have actual impacts on people in places. And so this is sort of the grounding of how we think about it. So this is sort of a poorly designed conceptual model just to think about this a little bit, but we're interested in talking and interviewing folks who are energy vulnerable, and also people who are working in the labor system, right? And so both of these have specific spatial and temporal context, right? So one of the things is that we think about in terms of energy vulnerable people is that there's certain things in those communities that lead these people to become energy vulnerable. So maybe it's high electricity prices, maybe it's pressing gentrification, increasing property taxes, those things that are forcing people to, for energy to become a bigger and more difficult part of their lives. But this is also a temporal thing, right? So we're talking about how our energy system is changing. So what are new opportunities that are emerging or maybe being closed off to some people as the system is changing, right? So we think about this in terms of spatial as well as temporal And then the link that we're trying to make here is between people's lived experiences. So we're starting with the interviews and then moving from our findings there to think about what are the laws and institutions that we can better understand or perhaps better shape in order to help these people. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. And then last is thinking about how we kind of move from these questions of energy governance and energy democracy, and then translating these into, some of the priorities that we're actually hearing. What are the public priorities that we're hearing? So in terms of the research team, I'm presenting today on behalf of our members of our team, which includes a couple folks in law, Shelley Welton from Penn, as well as Etienne Toussaint here at South Carolina with me, and Annie Eisenberg, who's moving to West Virginia. We have a postdoctoral fellow, Tashari White, who's here with me at South Carolina. And then Tennessee, we're working with Nikki Luke, who's a geographer. In addition, we have an undergraduate law student RAs. We have an 8-member advisory board that's been really helpful in helping us do some of the on-the-ground work. And especially what we've found extremely valuable is that we've hired what we refer to as community research assistants in each of our research sites. And they are people who are plugged into the community. Most of them are activists. Most of them have good, strong connections in these communities. And they're the ones who are helping us, identify people for interviews, because this is one of the biggest challenges I think you have, is how to, as academics, make inroads into some of these different communities. So in terms of where we're working, so just going from sort of right to left, Georgetown is a small rural community with a coal plant that's closing in South Carolina, coastal community. Lower Richland County is right outside of the capital city, Columbia, but it's an environmental justice community. It's been the site of numerous landfills. There's also a large coal plant that's also scheduled to close there. Nicholtown is a community in Greenville, South Carolina. Greenville is a city that's booming, and Nicholtown is undergoing rapid gentrification. All three of these are historically African-American communities. And then in Tennessee, Knoxville is a place where we're working, and there's sort of student-led gentrification that's occurring there. And then two of the other locations, Clear Fork Valley, had some coal mining that happened there, but it's an extremely rural area in Appalachia, primarily white. And then Kingston, you may know famously from the massive coal ash spill that happened there in the early 2010s. And subsequent deaths that occurred to the workers. So this is an area where we are really prioritizing our work to think about, energy labor, and think about what it means to have a transitioning system there. So I mentioned this a little bit. We're doing in-depth interviews with people in each of these communities. We're doing focus groups with energy vulnerable, people working at energy labor. And then emerging from these interviews is where we kind of move to sort of a legal and policy analysis. The things that emerge out of these focus groups, we're trying to do this. We have a lot of, I'm excited about what some of our outputs are going to be. In addition to, your typical academic papers, we're going to be doing some workshops in the communities to present our findings. And we're also going to assemble what we are referring to as a people's guide to energy policy. So the goal of this is to help people, based on the things that we hear and the ways that people want to intervene or want their kind of priorities that they have, what are the ways in which you can start to intervene in the energy system? Who should you be contacting with these questions? Where are the places that you can get assistance? Because increasingly we're finding that assistance is not just coming from our federal programs, but there's lots of informal ways that people are getting energy assistance if they aren't able to pay bills, for example. And we're about maybe halfway through with our interviews. We haven't started the focus groups yet. So from that, I just will mention just a couple of our initial findings. We're just kind of getting in and starting to code our interviews, but some of the things that have come up that are interesting is, when we ask people about, not being able to pay their electricity bill, or, when they have to face, as many energy vulnerable people do, this decision about which bill to pay, how did they come to decide that they had to pay their electricity bill, where maybe some of their other bills, a health bill or a medical bill, some of those things they can sort of wait on. And we've heard a lot of interesting things about how people learn how to manage, their kind of finances in this way, learning from family, learning from neighbors, right? But one of the things that keeps coming up is that electricity is this essential that people always pay first. All the other bills seem to be able to wait, but electricity is the one that that's an interesting finding so far. A lot of the folks that we've talked with in rural areas use propane or fuel oil for their heating. Parts of South Carolina don't get that cold, but there's still a requirement for heating in the winter. And what we found is that a lot of the propane companies actually require credit checks, which is leading to some challenges for people when they move to a house to actually start getting the fuel that they need. So we are interested in kind of looking a bit more into that on the legal side. We've seen that there's varying opinions on solar. Most people, I say here, believe in the technology. Their interest, though, is in the way in which it can bring down their electricity bills. I mean, a lot of the energy vulnerable people we talk to, climate is sort of far from their top concern. There's things that are much more pressing in their lives. They're interested in it, but there's been a lot of bad sort of situations with scammers, people who have, promised one thing and not delivered. So there's varying opinions that we've seen on the solar industry. One of the things that we've been thinking about is, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, is thinking about how we can broaden our understanding of what we call energy jobs. So people who are working from home, there's a lot of low wage call center work, for example, that's taking place in people's homes now, which puts a demand on their energy system or on their energy needs in their house. So energy jobs maybe not necessarily are just people who are working, at a utility. It's also some of these jobs that are energy intensive, at least in the home. And then the one other thing that we found just almost accidentally through the course of this is that many of the utilities, particularly the TVA, is seemingly interested in better developing their public participation forums. And so we've been able to provide some information to some of the different groups who are working to try to shape those public participation. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is just some of the challenges that we've already run into in community-based research. Community-based research is I think a great approach to doing this, but I think we also have to be upfront with some of the challenges that we run into. And I'll touch on these just briefly, but happy to answer questions about some of this. The first is that, not surprisingly, you deal with a lot of personalities, a lot of different ways of working, and particularly close-knit communities. We had an incident with a community research assistant and one of the members of our project team where not everyone speaks to each other and as academics in the way that we maybe expect. So there had to be some kind of some smoothing out that happened in the relationship that soured, unfortunately, but seems to be kind of back in the right direction. But this is sort of a reality when we start thinking about how we work in communities that can be quite different than the sphere that academics primarily inhabit. And I think this is important as we start thinking about things like community benefit agreements, thinking about how those things are shared, how news can travel quite quickly in some of these close-knit communities. And so there's this question of sort of developing and maintaining trust. There's also, we've run into these problems of university logistics and bureaucracy, not entirely understanding the payment systems of how we pay our community research assistants. I encourage anyone who's doing something like this to actually sit and watch somebody fill out these forms before you try to explain them to somebody. We've run into problems with a gift card program. People have been really excited to receive gift cards as part of their participation, but one of our universities unexpectedly shut down the program. And so we've got some lessons learned that we're trying to get through and wrap up. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this in the questions if anyone has those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harrison. We're about halfway through the program, so this would be a good time to draw everyone's attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom. Feel free to click on that and ask any question of any of the speakers who have spoken or the speakers that will be speaking. Speakers, you're free to answer if you'd like in writing in the actual Q&A, or we can do it verbally later on video. Our next presenter is Dr. Brian Patterson, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Here we go.
Mute. All right. Can everyone hear me? Okay, we're good. All right. So one of the things about my particular project, analyzing systematic barriers for clean energy research and innovative systems, our project hypothesis is based around that there are structural and systematic biases that continue to influence and shape decision-making when it comes to high-level policy, especially when it comes to underserved and historically marginalized participants. This includes not only communities and populations, but also the structures around them, specifically looking at institutions that do influence and have strong bearings within their communities. Understanding these systematic changes have positively affected the impacts of what we call this pipeline of innovators that contribute to the United States clean energy economy. Ultimately, these findings from this research study hopefully will inform not only policymakers, programs, but also shed light into where there is what we call a void in providing opportunity and resources. I'm speaking on behalf of my research team. We have a great diversity of researchers from Florida Atlantic, who's representing traditionally what we call minority serving institutions, Dr. Yaz from Ohio State, and then also community action agency that focuses on HBCUs, community development, and a host of other activities around clean energy systems and development. So the purpose of our study is really to develop a better understanding of these structural and systematic barriers. When you think about barriers, that could be everything from effective information to effective partnering. So the biases under this access and also participation of racially and economically challenged communities has sort of been a focus, especially when we look at state funding, incentives, and other policies and programs that promote research, development, and commercialization when it comes to clean energy. And so similarly, what you heard earlier is also a snapshot of looking at what are these barriers that are also tied to some implicit biases around these marginalized racial and ethnic researchers and communities. As a part of the study, we really thought about, well, where does this all start? Where does this clean energy research start? How are we getting access to it? How do we now promote what we see in the future as moving forward as what I would say the next group of people moving forward? What structural and systematic barriers for historically Black colleges and universities, understanding that the presence of these institutions, as well as minority serving institutions, have a great presence as well as responsibility in creating this new pipeline of new clean energy innovators. And so naturally, many of the activities that we've done so far is looking at where are these institutions really meeting the policy and resources. So understanding these systematic barriers and biases naturally have had a positive impact on diversifying the pipeline, but how are these pipelines now consistently made, continue to grow? Ultimately, we started our research and looked at not only how researchers are being not only connected, but also policymakers from various forms from the state, federal, and also local communities. We'll continue to examine more of the barriers along marginalized racial ethnic researchers in lieu of their communities. Oftentimes, these institutions are tied to the communities that they have served historically. And so we'll look at the regional innovation systems around activities within those particular systems. As we talk a little bit more about it, we'll talk about the quantitative and qualitative understanding of these models that I'll share with you in just a second, but very intentionally looking at historically Black colleges and universities, and also what has been deemed as minority serving institutions compared to those who are not meet these two categories. And last but not least, our policies. We will look at how we would encourage, share, and hopefully create some level of energy around providing a best practices for policymakers that will address some of these concerns and issues. But specifically, as we look at our objectives, and the first one is really to look at and identify what structural barriers, some system biases that have been present that we can identify. Our second objective is really looking at our presence or our energy around historically Black colleges and universities. Are they getting funding or actively being provided opportunities to connect not only the funding to the institution, but also develop resources as it relates to people, personnel, and additional resources and partnerships for these endeavors. And last but not least, looking at energy justice, energy equality, equity, looking at clean energy development as it relates to what are the policies, but also how are these policies influencing the communities that they serve. Some of our deliverables, as mentioned before, one of the things that we thought about as we looked into this research is that how do we do an effective way of getting the story told? Oftentimes, historically Black colleges and even minority serving institutions are added to larger and major research opportunities as co-PIs or specific interest groups, but not necessarily leading this research. And so one of the objectives, and through the support of Sloan, we're able to kind of tackle this problem. So we're conducting 4 regional case studies of MSIs as well as HBCUs, looking at researchers and their experiences and their funding activities, conducting clean energy technology innovation. So not only looking at the research, but also how this is now being moved and promoted to actually innovation. Our second deliverable is really establishing and engaging the project with an advisory board. This advisory board then will engage not only our regional, but also our state energy policy makers. And so we have the intentionality of putting people on advisory committees and boards that will help inform this initiative and moving forward with not only discussing how this will be a plan for the future, but also a step-by-step guide in helping to reestablish or create a new pipeline. A couple of publications in regards to clean energy research naturally is a part of our product. And also what was mentioned before is the intentionality of grooming and growing our next group of innovators, where we have graduate students, undergraduate students that are on this project looking at clean energy analysis, as well as our other organizations as mentioned in bullet point number 7, NASIO, BW Research, and our HBCU Community Action Agency. As mentioned before, the scope of this research, I'm sorry, going the wrong way, apologize. So as we started our research, we wanted to look at a very specific flow of how we would attack this. We have 5 steps that we developed and designed very intentionally to tackle this major undergoing. One, a biometric analysis in which we would start to look at where are the funding sources, what has been historically funded, and if that hasn't been funded, what are some of the reasons why? And so as a part of that, after conducting our biometric analysis, we then have moved to our interview stage. So we're actually interviewing researchers, faculty members, other people who are involved in the inner goings or inner workings of these initiatives around clean energy or even STEM-related research at historically Black colleges and universities, as well as MSIs. And so we're in the process of doing that. Currently, we're tying that up and then moving toward focus groups where we'll get more of a group think and getting a little deeper dive into some of the themes that we've already identified. We'll do a little bit more around our data analysis, in which we're going to then tie that into not only our best practices, but also what some would say a scorecard, in which we're now going to provide a measurement that we will share out with local, state, and federal agencies. And last but not least, a survey to help kind of tie all of this work together. As mentioned before, quantitative as well as qualitative analysis, looking at some of the institutions, specifically starting with the federal government that fund research around clean energy, looking at different databases, as you see here, as far as the quantitative analysis. And then, as I mentioned just briefly before, really doing a robust qualitative analysis, doing interviews, and then backing those interviews up with focus groups. One of the things we are doing that is very intentional is stratifying not only the mainstream institutions with HBCUs, but also with larger firms, meaning that different innovation systems, as well as businesses that are working within that clean energy spectrum. So we're not just looking at it from a research only, but we're looking at it from a research to an applied process. And the role of government and nonprofits, matching a minority with mainstream, looking at what comparisons are being understood in these spectrums, but also understanding what are the patterns that we would see and seeing how we can change the landscape. As I mentioned before, we are looking at developing some keys to this pipeline. And if we don't have representation of these new researchers or innovators, this is going to continue to be a challenge as we move forward into really changing the landscape of clean energy in general. So the types of organizations, briefly, we talked about university, mainstream. One of the comparisons that we have to understand is large versus small. Looking at historically Black colleges and universities in comparison to mainstream institutions, you know that there is a tremendous difference. And when I say a tremendous difference for our size, resource, and all of the capabilities as it relates to just in comparison, but that does not reflect the idea around research and the qualified faculty and staff that are doing the work at these smaller or intentional institutions. So we want to make sure that that voice is now lifted up. In addition, we're looking at companies and enterprises that are supporting this initiative around clean energy research. In addition to that, we're looking at non-for-profits. As a part of our as a part of our research, we started looking at different federal organizations and groups that have historically provided funding, whether from a more global perspective on energy, but all the other different departments from federal funding that we started. And first off, we started with the Department of Energy, naturally, where we identified 146 different programs that provided some level of connectivity around energy-based projects, and that also reached out to, let's say, various different groups and supported the natural idea around these are important research opportunities for us. And so as a part of this, we looked at this from a kind of a model from a regional innovation systems approach. And so looking at different frameworks for a political environment, taxes, so going into the community, understanding entrepreneurial spirit, to now seeing how this enterprise affects not only the community or the direct stakeholders, but also how it informs research. And are these two groups or entities, are they connecting? So we also look at the idea around professional development, professional training, the public sector, how all of these are now connecting and the infrastructure is moving forward. As I mentioned before, we identified 4 regions, specifically in the state of North Carolina, the state of Georgia, and the state of Florida. And as you see here, we're identifying different institutions and both mainstream as well as different HBCUs and minority serving institutions. And a part of that is also pulling back some of the data that we've been able to find from a historical lens of where these resources are being allocated, if these resources are being found, what are the stories being told. And this is just some preliminary information or data, that we've been able to find. And as a part of this is only a piece of the story that we want to share. And so as you see here with some of the numbers, there's some alarming numbers where, is this telling the true story, or is it just an issue of maybe something different, that there is a lack of connectivity, a lack of resource, a lack of engagement? What are the factors that are influencing?
Can we start the wind down, since we're out of time? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Absolutely. So as a part of that, again, one of the things that we'll share is this areas that we targeted where HBCUs and historically minority serving institutions are found, and started targeting these researchers and different groups. And so right now we're looking at this as the bigger picture, bigger question. Are we going to find the larger scale success where everyone is getting equal access, or is this a larger scale failure, meaning that opportunities and activities are not being shared main scale? So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Harrington. We will now move to our final speaker, Dr. Elise Taylor Ani-Kiri. And again, a reminder that you can do the Q&A, and I see some of our panelists are hard at work at answering them. And the ones that we don't get to, we'll get to in the Q&A section after this presentation is done. So I'm going to hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Dr. Elise Taylor Ani-Kiri at the Department of Energy. My presentation will focus a little bit less on the research side of place-based energy, but more how it's happening in practice. The Department of Energy is one of the main agencies responsible for the clean energy transition. So DOE historically has been mainly thought of as a traditionally place-neutral technology-focused agency. So you think about our solar energy office, our wind energy office, Office of Fossil Energy, always very technology focused. And during this administration, we're making an active effort to be more have a place and people-based approach. It's kind of a shift in our thinking. We've always done some place-based research. We're trying to be more active in that engagement. And what does that mean for us? So for place-based, in terms of how we are defining it, so the core elements for success, include an agreed upon definition of place, who you are targeting and for what reason, recognizing specific challenges and opportunities. That's one thing we're really big on, is not doing a one size fits all. If we're going to focus on a place or a group of people, one solution isn't going to work for all of them most of the time. One thing we're really focusing on is doing a better job engaging community members and stakeholders and not bringing them a solution, but really understanding their problems and then developing a solution with them. Taking a systems approach, really looking at historical inequities and how do we factor that in and making sure that we are distributing resources appropriately to account for that. And then also trying to be in a continuous model of learning and adapting as we engage. So our specific definition is place-based approaches that are target specific energy or technology related challenges and opportunities for communities with the goal of supporting a region's transition to a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. Really focusing on engaging local community members and stakeholders and making this a part of a whole of government approach. In terms of our goals, so when we work with communities, we're really focusing on making sure that the energy transition is sustainable. So we're not just focused on a single industry, but built around meeting our climate objectives, so that it is resilient. Kind of, as I said before, not anchored in just one technology, but being strong and diversified around a set of industries, and then equitable, considering historical inequities and how do we make sure that we are correcting for those things. Sorry. In terms of the ways that we are doing that, we have focused on targeted increased investment in our priority communities, would that be with our grants, our loans, our loan guarantees, targeted increased investment, streamlining DOE programs. DOE has been known to be a bit siloed, so how do we do a better job connecting internally with DOE to make it easier for people to access our programs and services? And kind of an extension of that is interagency collaboration. So our DOE may be one of the main agencies responsible for the clean energy transition. We are certainly not the only agency, so doing a better job connecting with our sister agencies to deliver services. A connection to the broader domestic and international policy agenda, as well as spotlight from the secretary and deputy secretary whenever they do their traveling, really highlighting and prioritizing or lifting up our priority communities. One of our other key elements that we've been using to prioritize place-based initiatives is community benefits plans. So for a lot of the funding that we got through the Infrastructure and Investment Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of those programs require you to have a community benefits plan. And then that plan is usually worth 20% of the technical merit points. So when you're trying to be assessed and evaluated to win something. And in that, you kind of really have to specify how you're meeting the Justice 40 initiative, which I'll talk about briefly, how you are thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, like working with HBCUs and other minority serving institutions, a focus on good jobs, being able to attract and retain skilled workers, and then also using workforce and community agreements if you're going to bring a project to the community, making sure you're meaningfully engaging with that community and making sure they're receiving benefits, and those benefits are stated and in some type of document that would be enforceable. In terms of who DOE has decided is a priority community, historically is who we are focusing on more newly with this administration. I'm going to kind of run through those as well. So historically, I think the one longest standing community that we've engaged with would be the environmental or nuclear cleanup communities. The origin of the Department of Energy is focused on nuclear research, nuclear energy research, and nuclear weapons research. And there's a long history there, and just our obligation to try and really help clean up those communities and clean up that environmental legacy. For this administration, it's been a big focus on Justice 40. And Justice 40 means that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments must flow to disadvantaged communities. And here on the right, you see a map of how DOE has defined that and what communities we're highlighting. So that includes communities that have been just historically left behind, but also some of tribal communities in our territories. So we're doing a lot to focus in on these communities that have that have historically suffered discrimination and things in the energy transition. So really focusing in on these communities, making sure they receive benefits as we kind of transition to a different kind of energy economy. We're also focusing kind of in that same vein, that same thread. We're still also focusing on energy communities. So in the same executive order that established the Justice 40 initiative, it also established the interagency working group on coal and power plant communities and economic revitalization. And the goal of this group is to really focus on energy communities that have been the bedrock of the energy industry in the past. And as we kind of transition away from coal and fossil fuels, making sure that these communities are not left behind and making sure we're connecting them with the right economic opportunities and figuring out how do we revitalize them as well. So this is another priority community for us. And then lastly, rural communities. So another focus of this administration is rural communities. DOE is an active participant in the Rural Partners Network. So Rural Partners Network is an all-of-government program with like 25 different agencies and commissions that helps rural communities find resources and funding to create jobs and infrastructure. And we're really active in that as well. And now I'm going to go over a few of DOE's place-based programs. So I think one of their biggest programs is actually the National Labs. National Labs are spread all across the United States, are longstanding institutions, and have long been anchors in where they are, but also big drivers in innovation and commercialization. So it's one of our biggest programs. Is just our work through the National Labs and how they spur not only research, but economics as well. We also have place-based offices where we really engage with communities directly. So two examples of that would be the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, which really focuses on working with tribal nations and Alaska corporations. And the Arctic Energy Office, which is focused on working in the Arctic and Alaska Native corporations as well. Another major project that we have that's been longstanding is the Energy Transitions Initiative. So this program really focuses on working with rural and remote communities. It's been longstanding. So a lot of islands or people where resilience is a really big issue that are often dependent on oil or other unsustainable sources and not hooked to a mainland grid. So it's hard to be resilient. So we started this program to figure out how do we help island communities and remote communities be more self-reliant. The Puerto Rico Initiative, the Department of Energy has been working with Puerto Rico since 2017. Hurricane Maria kind of really devastated the infrastructure there, and it's been a long-term engagement to try and figure out how do we improve infrastructure in Puerto Rico and make them more resilient. I think one of the biggest initiatives that we have right now is the Puerto Rico 100 study, which is focused on how do we help Puerto Rico achieve its goal of 100% renewable energy by 2050. As a part of that initiative, we're doing a ton of community engagement, talking to Puerto Rican citizens about what are they looking for? What are their needs? How do they want to see this transition happen? Doing a lot of scenario generation and modeling to say, what are the possibilities to meet this? And then impact analysis. Should we choose one of these modeling scenarios? What are the impacts on the local community? Also, signature to this administration is the Communities LEAP program, or Communities Local Energy Action Program. And this is focused on helping low income and energy burden communities that have experienced environmental justice challenges or direct economic impacts from reduced fossil fuel use to really drive and create community action plans for what their clean energy transition will look like. So these communities want to understand, 10, 20 years from now, what does it look like for us to transition? Because it's a different answer for every community, and helping them chart that path and figure out how do they get there? What's the appropriate funding that you might need? And what are the things that you need to be doing? We selected 24 communities in March of 22, and they are doing a great job kind of executing on those plans. And then lastly, we have the energy improvements in rural and remote areas. This was funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and this provides $1 billion to improve resilience and safety, reliability, and the availability of energy in rural and remote areas. So when they say rural remote areas, that's just cities or towns with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. This is a program that started rolling out to really focus on our rural communities. One thing that's really nice about this program, again, focusing on helping disadvantaged communities actually access these programs. So this has developed focused technical assistance that you can get through the national labs or EPA's technical community or thriving communities technical assistance centers. So actually helping communities apply for these programs. And that's just a brief highlight of some of the different place-based programs that we have historically had and that we put in place recently to try and really meet the need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elise. Gosh, I wish we had like unlimited time to hear all these presentations, but unfortunately we don't. But I think there's been some great questions in the Q&A, and we're going to move into our full-on Q&A session. So at this point, folks, if you have other questions, please place them in the Q&A box in the bottom. As I was mentioning earlier, a lot of the panelists are already feverishly typing answers and getting to your questions. So I'm going to pose some questions to all the panelists in the meantime while we continue the populating the question area here. So the first question is, and I'm not going to ask all the speakers if you can turn your video on and put it on mute. And if you want to answer the question, obviously you can unmute. And so the first question for all of you is that all the researchers have mentioned an advisory board. Could you talk about how you pick your board members and how you engage with them, as it is a critical part, as you've all mentioned, of doing this community-based work in a principled way. So for all the researchers and anyone who wants to take this first, how did you pick your board members and how do you engage with them? Anyone?
Well, I can start. One of the things that we established that was very important, that we had a great representation of not only people who were in faculty roles who spoke the language of research and development, but just a collaboration of even state energy resource officers to people in the community. So just a diversity of different perspectives, even from understanding what the definition of clean energy, how is that research being implemented in your community, what are some resources. So, I mean, we looked at it from a holistic perspective, which makes it really difficult to get everyone to say, hey, we're talking the same language, but then we have intentionally looked at segmenting different parts of getting our committee together as it relates to each aspect of our research. And so when I say that, as it gets closer to policy making and so our best efforts, we would run that by more of the community and innovation, folks to see if we're hitting the mark, if that makes sense. So kind of not only collecting from a broader perspective, but also staging how we would utilize their expertise.
Do any of the other panelists want to take a crack at this?
I can share a little bit about our current status of advisory board planning and use. And I would say our perspective on this has continued to evolve as our team has continued to work together. And one thing that came up as you know, we, like others on this call, have an interdisciplinary set of researchers working on this. And one of the things that we as a team decided was a critical role for our advisory board was to be able to help us talk with each other. And so we actually ended up focusing our kind of formal academic advisory board on senior scholars who have worked in this space, who can really help advise us on research design and working together on the research side. And then as we go forward into our project, we're not yet there yet, but as we go forward and have our much more community engaged elements of the project, we have now kind of intended to shift, for example, project resources that were initially allocated towards advisory board members to what will be kind of community engagement opportunities to engage in the project that are actually going to be a separate entity than our kind of academic advisory board, so that we can have different venues to work on different aspects of the project. And that's kind of how we've ended up at this so far. And I expect this to continue to evolve as our project continues to evolve as well.
I can speak to it just really quickly, Al. So our advisory board is composed of, I think we have 8 members. 2 of them are academics. And then the remaining are largely community activists of some form or another, some in the labor sphere, some in sort of the more environmental energy justice sphere, and they're spread across the 2 states that we're working in. They've been incredibly instrumental to helping us sort of scope out the project and selecting the locations that we're going to work. You know, I'm thinking specifically of a couple of the people we've worked with in South Carolina, have really long experience working in these communities, and have then been able to help direct us towards the people more locally that we've been working with on more of the day-to-day in terms of and we call them our community research assistants. And we've worked with them on identifying participants for our interviews, trying to help understand a little bit better, maybe the lay of the land in some of these communities. And we've also used our advisory board. We meet with them maybe 3 times a year, and we've used them to, as we've sort of developed our list of questions that we were going to ask, we, ask them, like, in our interviews, or, are these good questions? Are there things that we're missing? What would you suggest? And we've also done that with our community research assistants. So being able to kind of get feedback along the way has been really valuable. And I should also mention that we compensate all of these people. And I think that compensation, some people have actually turned it down, but it's incredibly meaningful for a lot of people. And I think people put in a lot of time and a lot of effort, especially with our community research assistants. A lot of the work that they already do is unpaid, so this helps. It's not a ton of money, it's $1,000, but I think it's something meaningful for them, for the work they do.
Yeah, I was going to ask about whether there were any funds provided, and thanks for addressing that, Connor. So I have a question. There's a question here for Dr. Taylor Anikiri, and I think it's probably because there are so many academics and researchers here. The question really is, like, what can we do? What can the research community, academic community do to assist and advance the work that the DOE is engaged in this area?
Yeah, I think the work that they do is super helpful. It's helping us, like, we've defined priority communities, but that always needs, like I say, iteration to say, how can we better define, or how do we better meet people's needs? I think this research is super important to us to see some of the very locational specific work that people are doing to say how we can better work with communities. I think that's helpful. The work that Dr. Patterson is doing in terms of reaching minority serving institutions and HBCUs, it's good feedback for us on how we can do a better job engaging those institutions. We have a concerted effort in this administration to engage and do so, but it's always helpful to hear feedback, hear researchers say, when someone's going out and studying that problem, maybe to pick that up and then go and implement it. So I think that's how we really find that information helpful.
Thank you. This is for all the panelists again. I think some of you have covered this, but I think maybe it'd be great to do maybe a lightning round of each of you kind of talking about what are the biggest challenges or barriers to conducting the research that you're doing. Or maybe it's really easy and there are challenges to doing this work.
I'll say quickly, for me, it's been navigating the university research and sort of financial bureaucracy that's not necessarily set up to work with community partners. They want to treat everybody like a vendor and not as necessarily as a person. So that's taken a lot of time and just a lot of frustration, I guess, on my part.
I would say ditto on that. DOE is not necessarily, well, we do research here, but I think that's something we run into as well when we're trying to implement and work with communities at various levels and scales. We also have a hard time being able to get dollars into the hands of communities. There's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. People assume someone's going to do something bad. And we also have a lot of difficulty just getting hands into the members of communities. Like, oh, they always want to work through like a vendor-based something. And it's like, well, these are not vendors. It's just not, it's not the same thing. It's a very different thing, and trying to get that concept across to your procurement departments and to other legal red tape and get those things cleared is very challenging.
Elise, Nadia, or Brian?
I ditto what was shared earlier. I think the other challenge for our research project specifically is that we're trying to identify sometimes new people who are in these institutions that we don't know that they are there, because oftentimes if you're trying to identify people, you're identifying them by their work. And if you don't see any publications and understanding that they're out there doing the research, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. So I don't know who's where, who's doing what exactly. And there's not what would be wonderful, a clear repository of people who are doing this type of research in this particular area. I know through professional organizations and groups, we do start to find that, but at the same time, if you're doing what we're trying to do is identify, not only talk to talk to Brian, but understand Brian's challenges. Brian may have been at one school 10 years ago, and now he's somewhere else. And so, we're kind of doing a fact checking and kind of, trying to catch up with those folks. The other thing I think is important that has been a challenge is what was said before, is just being consistent with the work as it relates to post-COVID issues. And when I say that, many institutions, including mine, have been closed for about a couple of years. And when I say that, there hasn't been faculty on campus. They might have been doing work on their own, but they're not necessarily publishing or freely on campus. And so when I say that, it's just like restarting with students. They're learning to learn again. We're learning to find them again and do our work again. And I know that sounds maybe a little weird, but it has been a real weird experience. It's been like a little gap here, and it's like you dropped off the cliff, and maybe we'll find you again somewhere along the way. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. Thank you.
I'm wondering if there's, go ahead. Nadia.
That I think that when we're looking at these issues, like if we're seeing like these are delays that are happening in our project management, as well as like in terms of implementing different protocols for the project, I think that also translates over to the research as well, in the sense that the regulatory hurdles that exist in the permitting space are similar to some of those issues we may face, but that I think works to build our capacity as well to address these challenges.
Yeah, and I was also thinking of whether the temporal nature of research being slow, winding, and long, how that comports with community priorities on the ground, where they want change and now, and especially like as Elise was mentioning earlier, I think there's all these opportunities coming down from the federal government that they want to seize on, and the research probably would be helpful in helping to kind of figure out how do you deal with some of those challenges of like the research balancing that with community needs on the ground now. It's not an easy question.
I'll start with something. The two things that kind of jump to mind for me is one of the things that we are trying to be cognizant of is communities that are often the subject of research, and making sure that we're, deliberate in the way that we think about that. And part of that, a big part of that is the way that we can compensate people for their time. So I mentioned the gift cards, and it's certainly, probably for a lot of people, it's going to be way more significant, that a lot of people that we've been doing interviews with, it'll be way more significant for them if we're able to provide them with a $75 Visa gift card that they can use to pay their, electricity bill that month, than it would be the sort of research findings that are going to be 4 or 5 years down the road. So I think your temporal point is a really good one. And so, in a very, very small way, I think that's one way that we're trying to kind of think about that.
That's a great suggestion, one way to think about it and then compensate folks. Anyone else a thought on that?
I can offer one thought, which perhaps might be obvious to many people, but one of the things that I think about all the time when it comes to this question of how do you make this research responsive in many ways, is spending and devoting that time to relationship building and being there and showing up, whether it's in person or on Zoom or however people are asking you to show up, that you put in that time and effort. And that's at least, it may not mean that today's request is something that you can respond to in research, or that your research is, exactly aligned, but maybe next time it will be. And so that's at least what I think a lot about, is really being there and showing up in that manner.
Anyone else a thought on that? Okay, well, we got about 3 minutes left. I think we have time for another question. This one is about the idea of how do you scale the insights of your research to other places? Nadia, you mentioned that you want to talk about the international angle with this work, and someone in the Q&A talked about how some of this work apply to the West. So I'm curious about how do you scale these insights to other places?
Okay, thank you. So when we're looking at this issue, I think it's important to see kind of how we're looking at it from a local perspective, a state perspective, and national versus subnational, and then how we would translate that into the international space. So there are international bodies like the United Nations Environment Program that have really been championing this cause, but it takes significant amount of resources, as Elise had mentioned, about promoting public participation, but also how to do the environmental management. And so this is really about being able to make better decisions. And so for the collaborations to really happen between governments and community members, as well as the private entities, there really has to be a way for all stakeholders to have a say at the table. And even if you're looking at capacity building, even in India, as like the solar capacity generation that's happening, in many places you're going from areas where they have no electricity at all to solar power overnight. In areas where they had no communication, like no landlines, and they have mobile service. And so that really impacts economic development. And so I think we're going to learn from what is happening in other parts of the world.
Brian or Connor, on kind of the challenges of scaling?
I think that's probably one of the greatest challenge that we have, or just looking at our project. Can we reach our goal or get enough to saturate, the information to tell the story and be accurate on the story? That's the greatest challenge that I would say that we face, especially kind of when you don't know the complete landscape that you're kind of looking at. You're kind of going in blindly. And so even to work to scale, I think sometimes we have to kind of lean toward our best guesses. I'll just say that for the project that we're working on, looking at what some would say apples versus oranges as it relates to institutions. And so when you look at that, so one professor, one faculty member at, let's say, a HBCU, does that equal 3 or 4 at a PWI? Does that make sense? And so again, that for me is probably one of the challenges. And again, to be able to really ascertain the level of work and contribution to the industry is always a question. But at the same time, it is one of the stakeholders, is one of the markers that we have to not close our eyes to, but to actually drive a little deeper. So again, that's kind of the balancing that I think has been one of the challenges, and just to keep that kind of front and center, especially working with community and multiple partners. I always believe in this idea, and I'll end with this, just the right person at the right time in the right place, but I'm always looking for the right person. So if that makes sense, I'm looking for the people who can go deep dive on me and give me what I need, not just to push numbers out. So that's, again, for our scale.
Well, on that note, I think that was an excellent wrap up, actually. Want to wrap up this panel. Thank you, everyone, so much. And everyone, give a big round of applause, I guess, virtually, for this great panel. So this concludes kind of a trilogy of webinars we've done. The first one we did was in April, the Tribal Energy Transitions, Impact, Opportunities, and Research Ethics. And then we did another one in May on energy insecurity, energy transitions, obstacles, and opportunities. And of course, today is on place-based energy transition research. We will be posting this recording, so people who want to go back and revisit the presentation to catch things you didn't see before or to get contact information, it'll be posted on our website in events, past events, and it's the same with the other webinars too. And again, we thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for supporting this, and also of course, our presenters for sharing their incredible work. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all again, and have a great summer. Today is the last day of school for a lot of kids, so have a great summer, everyone. Thank you for joining.